And with that, I will take it over to tonight's speaker, Brendan.
All right. Try to share my screen. That look good for everyone? Yep. Okay, great.
Yep.
Well, welcome. I'm going to talk about cognitive liberty, which is sort of the name for the concept, and then I am adding to it that I believe that it establishes your right to get high. First, who am I? So I have a background in philosophy and neuroscience. I don't have any legal background. I was actually just thinking, so technically, I think most of what I actually called on, the skills I called on to put this presentation together, came from being a competitive debater in high school, strangely enough. Okay, in terms of my bio, I advocate for the rights of drug users, full-scale drug policy reform, and an end to the carceral system. I endeavor to diminish the stigma placed on drugs and drug users of all kinds. I identify as cisgender, able-bodied, heterosexual, white, and male. And I currently live in Boulder, which is the occupied land of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute people. Okay. It is my contention, my main contention, that you have a right, both a constitutional right and a human right, to alter your consciousness however you see fit. Failure by the state to acknowledge and respect this right is a miscarriage of justice. More specifically, I will argue that so long as they do not subsequently engage in behavior that harms others, individuals should not be prohibited from or criminalized for using mind-altering drugs and technologies. This idea is not new, actually, but to some it may seem very radical, particularly in an environment where prohibition of psychoactive substances is the norm. The idea that we have this right and have always had this right is hard to imagine. It is my hope to make the decision much more clear, so that hopefully if y'all have similar feelings that you can help spread these ideas. And for those of you who are skeptical, I hope to make you think about something. And I really hope at the end to have lots of time for Q&A if we want to have more discussion, because this topic is kind of infinite. And as you'll see, I think I can make the argument, the core argument, actually very quickly. Okay, so taking a little road thing, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the philosophical underpinnings of what I'm about to undertake, because it is very situated in a specific way of looking at the world. Okay, so I will be talking about how society should operate according to the Enlightenment ideals that formed the philosophical basis of the United States of America. This framework, very generally, asserts that free peoples have a set of fundamental, unalienable rights, which they are granted simply by being free beings. In order to provide services to society which require communal cooperation, free peoples may acquiesce, they might give up some of these, they might give up to some of these limitations on those rights. They might choose to do that. But importantly, these rights, these fundamental rights, are not surrendered permanently. The human being, by virtue of being human, still possesses them. If the state oversteps and tramples on these rights, the citizenry are justified in overthrowing it. That's the idea. And in America, we have this kind of soft overthrow idea connected to free elections, right? So the idea being that if we feel that the state has overstepped its bounds, that we should at least first attempt to overthrow it by changing our elected officials, not necessarily armed revolt. Although I consider that inside of the range of justified possibility, depending on the scope of the injustice that we're being forced to suffer. Okay, so this idea that I just talked about is very loosely known as social contract theory. In many ways, I find this idealistic conception of the role of the state to be quite beautiful. There's a lot of really interesting stuff there. But it is important to recognize that these concepts are steeped in history of whiteness, patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism. For many of the white men writing about free peoples at this time, they really only meant a very select number of other white men. And so I wish to borrow these ways of thinking, these overall ways of talking about rights and our relationship to the state, without adopting a lot of this baggage, if I can. So at least when I say free peoples, I mean all human beings, and likely many other beings as well. As I hope will become clear, I think this is the way in which we think and talk about rights in America. So I'm hoping that it will be the most persuasive way to talk about this concept, despite the fact that it is linked to a lot of unsavory things. Okay, so I'm now officially beginning the argument for cognitive liberty. I think the first part of this is the idea of self-ownership. As a basic aspect of our humanity, I argue that we have an a priori, meaning like before all things, de facto ownership over our bodies, minds, and spirit. Certainly no one else can plausibly have an a priori right to these things. Free societies implicitly assume the existence of free peoples. And in what sense could they possibly be free if they didn't have basic ownership over themselves? That's my question. It is generally accepted that, barring certain exceptions, members of a free society have the right to determine what happens to their bodies. This is the idea of bodily autonomy. We have the right to be free from assault by others. We have a right to choose our own medical procedures. We have a right to eat whatever we choose. All of these rights have qualifications. There are situations in which they don't apply. But these rights exist and ought to be respected, and that should be widely agreed upon. I think I'm still on pretty solid ground here. I think to lack any right to bodily autonomy would undermine all other foundational freedoms that we enjoy, and therefore undermine any attempt at a free society. I just wanted to say, as like an asterisk, when discussion arises around bodily autonomy, it's often in what I'd say in the context of controversial applications of the idea. So for instance, like people refusing to get vaccinated or opting for abortions, or like people who don't like those activities will often, when they're criticizing those people, the defense will come in the form of saying, like, we have a right to do whatever we want with our own bodies. We have bodily autonomy. And so I think that the idea of bodily autonomy has gotten a little eroded because of some of this like controversy. Like, I think there really are some people out there that like feel that we don't, in some circumstances, have a right to bodily autonomy. But it's important to point out that in those situations where people are arguing that our de facto right to bodily autonomy should be overruled by some extenuating circumstance. So they're saying you should be forced to get vaccinated because there is such a great risk to society at large that it overweighs your individual right to bodily autonomy. That is assuming that you have a right to bodily autonomy that one would need to justify overruling in order to be just in overruling that right. So this is just a point. I'm not trying to like establish anything about vaccines or abortion or anything. I'm just saying that I think no matter what, the assumption of all these conversations is that people have basic ownership over what happens to their bodies. And there might be some specific instances in which some people think that we shouldn't. But as a general rule, I think people agree that we should. Okay. If we have a right to bodily autonomy, then we should have a de facto right to mental autonomy. To begin with, our brains are part of our bodies. The same right to bodily autonomy that protects an individual against involuntary surgical procedures must also protect us from being forced to take psychoactive drugs, right? Like both of those seem like violations, and I would argue they're violations. One's a violation of our bodily autonomy, and one's a violation of our mental autonomy, but we both regard them as unethical. Our minds are inextricably linked to our brains. So the right to freedom from mental interference follows quite easily from any idea that we have a right to a freedom from interference with our own bodies. Let's see. Some examples to kind of bring this home. So like hypnosis, brainwashing, propaganda, advertising, all of these technologies have the ability to alter our minds involuntarily. And I think that most of us can feel that often applications of these technologies are unethical, and the state in enacting those technologies would be unjust in doing so. We have to give consent for these things because we have an exclusive ownership over our minds, right? The reason that we think that those things are wrong, the reason it would be wrong for the state to systematically dose people with LSD against their will or knowledge, right, is because they have a de facto right to having their mind to be free from interference by the state. So that's just to say, I also believe we have a right to mental autonomy. From that, we can get, I think, very quickly your right to get high. So if we accept that we have an a priori ownership over ourselves, and therefore a right to be free from undue interference with our bodies and minds, it follows quite easily that you must have the right to alter your own state of mind however you wish. For instance, bodily autonomy does not just mean that you have the right to be free from interference. It requires that in general, you be free to pursue alterations to your own body as you see fit. You can eat what you want, you can get elective surgeries, you can get tattoos, you can get piercings. These things are not just conveniences or something that we casually have. Like those are actual rights that we have. I have a right to alter my body. Similarly, our mental autonomy should give us the right to pursue alterations to our own minds as we see fit. Our thoughts, our memories, our perspectives, our states of consciousness, these are ours to be experienced without interference from anyone except ourselves. Just like arguments for bodily autonomy, mental autonomy requires that we be able to seek mental states freely and use mind-altering technologies without criminalization. You could also think of this as like the right to mental self-determination, for instance. It's not just a freedom to be free from someone messing with your mind. It's a freedom to pursue states of mind freely. Okay, I've chosen the term get high to describe altering consciousness because I think there is a tendency in these conversations to prioritize some altered states of consciousness over others in a moralistic fashion. Barring special circumstances, I believe this freedom applies to all of us for the various reasons and intentions one might have for altering their consciousness. They could be doing it for fun, or for personal insight, or for religious celebration, and I believe that the right to mental self-determination remains intact. So that's why I said get high. I felt it was the most challenging implicitly of those assumptions, that ranking sort of thing. I do not believe that there is a just way to prioritize some states of consciousness over others. I would agree that serotonergic psychedelics, that would be like LSD, mescaline, etc. Insert there. I would agree that these drugs, for instance, can provide incredibly valuable states of consciousness that can make people more integrated and sometimes even better world citizens. But I also recognize that people have long smoked opium, specifically for the profound dreams and alterations of perception that result. With proper community support and context, even alcohol can be part of a socially productive ritual. And y'all can't see this, but I have citations for the two things that I just said. If all of these drugs can lead to valuable experiences for their users, they should have the freedom to pursue them. People should have that right. The states of mind afforded by psilocybin should be just as protected as those afforded by heroin or yoga or breath work or alcohol. Conversely, we can certainly use psychedelics without reverence and learn little to nothing from our experiences with them. Nonetheless, many of us have come to a reverent use of psychedelics through a recreational use. That's certainly the case for me. If my using just for fun ultimately led to me improving myself anyway, and coming to a reverent relationship with psychedelics anyway, how can we limit the use of others based on their motivations for using? Isn't it possible that all use is therapeutic use at some level? Okay, importantly, I do not think our freedom to get high necessitates that we have easy or readily available access to any particular methods for altering consciousness. You can have the freedom to alter consciousness without the tools at your disposal. I do not think, however, that the state could forbid access by making manufacture and distribution of these mind-altering technologies illegal. Surely, at least, there would have to be some standard of proof that the sale and manufacture and consumption of these particular technologies causes more harm than good. Ideally, some balance would have to be met between individual autonomy, individual safety, and public good. At least that's how I think about rights. Okay, so I just finished, to me, that's the end. That's the whole thing. Like on some level, that is the reason that we have the right to get high, right? It's because we have ownership over ourselves by default, right? No one else does. And the state has done nothing. And I'll talk about this a little more, but the state has done nothing to establish that any particular drugs or ways of altering consciousness are more harmful than good. They haven't done that analysis. The DEA does nothing to justify its decisions in the scheduling system. It is inherently anti-scientific in its outlook. And therefore, the state's attempt to prohibit these drugs is unjust. So this is just to say, a lot of what I'm about to go over is just like kind of belaboring the same point in ways that I hope will make it more and more convincing. But at its core, I think that self-ownership leads us to cognitive liberty, which leads us to the right to get high, like philosophically and conceptually. And I would love to hear if anyone has any stuff in the Q&A about critiques of that. Okay, so now let me try to like situate this inside of like actual law and policy. So there isn't in any of our laws in America or in the West, anything that's specifically saying that we have a right to mental self-determination, like I've like laid out. We have a lot of other rights, but to be honest, like our laws don't talk a lot about your internal states. It's not generally how they legislate. So anyway, the two places I find for basis for this right, I think that it's implicitly embodied first in our Bill of Rights. Our Bill of Rights specifies the freedom to speak freely, which clearly implies the right to think freely. There is, of course, little use to the right to say whatever you want if you are disallowed to think whatever you want. This would suggest that our First Amendment rights require the right to mental self-determination. That's what I think you have to do to get from A to B. Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes a fundamental human right to freedom of thought. I believe the very notion of existing as a legal person is predicated upon the assumption of this right, the freedom of thought. No one could consensually enter into the hypothetical social contract if we do not assume that their mental self-determination was intact at that veil of ignorance moment. Importantly, this would make mental self-determination a human right, meaning that you have it whether or not the state acknowledges it. Right. So like the state can tell you that you don't have this right and they're simply mistaken and are actually enacting what we call a human rights violation. If we accept that society should, in general, protect an individual's right to think whatever they want, then I believe it follows quite clearly that society should protect an individual's right to think however they want. Different states of consciousness give us access to different ways of thinking and therefore to different thoughts. How can it be said that we have freedom of thought if we don't have the freedom to alter our way of thinking however we see fit? And is in much the same way that freedom of speech is hollow without freedom of thought, I argue that freedom of thought is drastically truncated, it's like cut down, without freedom of states of mind. I believe that this right as well is a basic assumption of our legal system. Up until recently, it was simply assumed that the mind is a private sphere which cannot and probably should not be interfered with. But now we're beginning to develop the technology, both to more finely measure the neural impact of various events and to affect the brain directly while it's alive. It is conceivable that a state might try to systematically alter the mental states of some of their citizenry. In fact, we've already seen examples of that for like MK Ultra, for instance. Or I would argue like Cambridge Analytica and like systematically using Facebook and social media to mislead people and give them false information about their elections, their presidential elections. And I think that those are examples of these things like actually happening now. And when the state does those things, I think it's really disputed that it's a violation of some basic right to autonomy, right, of some kind. It is important to say, though, that this isn't spelled out anywhere. And I think that's dangerous. I really do. I think that we, moving into the next like decades, are going to need to start to think of our minds as like something not only that we have like ownership over, right, but that we have some sort of autonomy around its influence. Because otherwise there's no law that says that the government can't come in and brainwash us, right? Like there's nothing saying that this is wrong, you know, like no one's forcing us with political or police force, right? And so like where does that land? And like no one is like putting that in letters on paper, and I think that's really disturbing. Okay, so this isn't necessary to talk about, but I just couldn't do this presentation without including this Terence McKenna quote, because I feel like everyone always does when I talk about cognitive liberty. The quote is, "If the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness don't include the right to experiment with your own consciousness, then the Declaration of Independence isn't worth the hemp it was written on." I do want to mention, just because one should, that the Declaration of Independence was probably not written on hemp. It was more likely animal skins or linen. And I think that Terence just put that in there because it was like an extra like jab. Anyway, he makes an important point though. We are a nation founded on the idea of liberty and self-ownership. And how can that freedom possibly not apply to our own inner landscape? Okay. This part is where we get like into the weeds a little bit, and you don't have to talk about any of this to establish that we have a right to get high. I feel like we've already covered that. But when I said a person has the right to get high so long as their actions don't directly cause harm to others, that's a big asterisk, right? Like there's a lot of ways that the state could come in and say that any drug use causes more harm than good, or you know what I mean? Like there has to be some way that we talk about a way to establish some kind of standard or burden of proof in order to have any sort of limitations of these rights be just. And we let in like a really dangerous gray area by admitting that, like, surely if someone's behavior is harming people, that isn't like a fundamental right of theirs. Anyway, okay, so that's why I'm talking about. I call it the harm qualification. It really applies to essentially every right, any freedom that we think of in society, as I'll make clear. So in a civil society, individuals can express their inalienable freedoms so long as doing so doesn't directly cause undue harm to others. That's an important one, undue harm to others. On top of freedoms like negative rights, members of society also have some rights to be free from harm or assault by others. Therefore, for everyone's rights to be properly protected, individual freedoms must be limited to some degree. Hopefully that makes sense. We can see examples of this throughout our society right now. So for instance, we have freedom of speech, but cannot falsely yell fire in a crowded building. We have a right to earn a living, but not if it involves stealing from someone else. In relation to alcohol, we are free to drive our car, but cannot do so intoxicated. And these examples are general freedoms. So the freedom to speak, the freedom to amass property, the freedom to drive, are given weight in the sense that special circumstances have to be present for the state to justly prohibit their expression, right? So in the case of freedom of speech, the limitation is you can't cause mass panic with it. In amassing property, you can't steal from people. See what I mean? But there's only specific situations in which that's been placed into the case. Those are special situations. There's qualifications to what we agree is otherwise a right that every citizen holds. And I argue, so this harm principle is generally how we think about freedoms and their limitations. It's not like special to this drugs conversation to say that you have to limit freedoms based off of harm to the other people. Okay, it's always been difficult to define, however, when exactly a person's behavior is a direct cause of harm to another, such that it should be regulated or prohibited. In the case of drugs, there are certainly activities that for the safety of others may need to be done relatively sober. So like operating heavy machinery, caring for young children, performing surgery, for instance. But I would ask, could people be doing those activities on stimulants, right? Like maybe we say they can't be on downers, but I don't see any reason that they can't necessarily be on certain amounts of stimulants. I would argue that a lot of those people are currently on stimulants as they do those activities. So it gets complicated quickly to define in any just way what states of mind are acceptable for which activities and like which activities should be legislated around. I'm not going to be able to answer this today. I'm just trying to point out some of these issues. There are those who will certainly feel that some drugs are riskier than others. As a society, we could potentially afford having psilocybin widely available, but drugs like heroin or PCP should surely remain restricted or potentially still prohibited entirely. But then my question for that is, which drugs and on what basis? Most of us have strong intuitions about the proper hierarchy of drug dangers, but we also have been brainwashed by decades of anti-scientific propaganda surrounding the actual benefits and risks of many of these substances. For instance, how can we know that crack cocaine is a terrible life-destroying drug if our only exposures to it are inextricably linked with marginalized and oppressed people in terrible and life-threatening conditions? What if, with the proper purity and dose and support, users of this drug could maximize its benefits and thrive? How would we know? This is complicated by every attempt to prohibit a drug in the United States and in the world, therefore, pretty much, has been rooted in discrimination towards some particular marginalized group. So opium and Chinese immigrants, marijuana and black jazz musicians, LSD and hippies, PCP and black men with superhuman strength. I could go on for quite a while. As a nation, our beliefs about the benefits and drawbacks of a given drug have always been motivated by cultural bias rather than anything more objective. So this issue won't be resolved here, obviously. I kind of considered trying to get into it deeper, but it just gets more and more complicated as you go along. So instead, I want to highlight the way that I'm thinking about this issue rather than any kind of conclusion I'm coming to. If we are to live in a free and just society, one that prioritizes freedoms but is respectful of possible harms, then we must justify why access to a given state of mind should be limited, because we have a right to it. See, so that's how the whole conversation has shifted around like what drugs should we let out on the street, and instead I'm saying you need to justify what drugs you can stop us from accessing because we have a right to those drugs by default. So if we do not try our best to be dispassionate in ranking drug harms, we risk reinstitutionalizing the same racist and classist impacts of the war on drugs in a new form. The drugs perceived by the dominant culture to be more dangerous because the people associated with it are marginalized will be made harder to access. In this event, we will see many of the same injustices we observe now. Marginalized communities will be over-policed because they're using the bad kind of drugs. Drug users will remain using deadly contaminated street supply and therefore will die in greater numbers. And much of those harms will be erroneously attributed to the substance itself. We'll stay in this little circle that we have going on, where the government makes it incredibly dangerous and deadly to use drugs and then points to the deadliness and dangerousness of those drugs as a reason to maintain that system. Okay, so this is actually kind of just fun. I don't necessarily even have to talk about this slide either, but I just want to highlight in some of the ways that are like drug mythology and like how brainwashed we have gotten, how far from objectively verifiable facts most of our beliefs about the dangers of drugs really are. Okay, so admitting that drug use can be justifiably restricted in order to prevent harm to others is risky, as there are those who will certainly claim that all or most drug use is inherently dangerous or damaging. I don't have time here to systematically debunk every myth or propaganda-induced stigma against various drugs and drug users. My hopes is of demonstrating how distorted mainstream views are on drugs, so I'm going to address a few commonly held but empirically false beliefs about drugs. Importantly, I do not want to suggest that permitting drug use should be contingent upon debunking any of these myths. The burden of proof should be with the state to establish an objective risk-benefit analysis with scientific evidence. Unless proven otherwise, access should be default, as it is our right. That is at least my position. Okay, so first, false belief, false but widely held belief. PCP causes psychosis and violence against self or others. So first of all, it's important to know PCP is nearly identical to ketamine. Ketamine is actually a PCP analog. They are very, very similar drugs. I would argue, was misused in medical settings. It was invented to be an anesthetic, and so it was being given in like 10 to 20 times what we consider like the conventional recreational dose for PCP, because it's attempting to anesthetize people for surgery. It's attempting to give them enough PCP that they can cut them open and they won't do anything about it. It is true that PCP can trigger what we call excited delirium in high doses over time, just like amphetamines, like Adderall or THC. Like both of those also can cause excited delirium in high doses over time. Generally, this delirium is temporary, but it can be very dangerous in an unsupported setting, mainly due to police contact. Actually, mostly it's dangerous because the police might show up. Often PCP was blamed for causing psychosis in users of other drugs because there was a belief that it was being cut into things or sold as other drugs. Like this is in like the 80s and 90s. While this may have happened to some degree, it almost certainly did. These PCP psychosis stories were generally not verified by any toxicology screenings. The myth, therefore, sort of just reinforced itself, right? So like this person was acting in ways that we didn't expect. We think they were on drugs. I bet it was PCP because PCP causes psychosis. And that was regarded as more evidence that PCP causes psychosis, see? So ketamine, which it doesn't cause what we call excited delirium, but it does cause delirium in high doses. When they're using it in medical settings for surgery, they call this emergence delirium, which basically means like as people come out of being anesthetized for surgery on ketamine, they're tripping. They call it emergence delirium. But the thing is with ketamine is, so ketamine versus PCP, ketamine interferes with what's called your proprioception, your ability to like balance and move through space for longer than PCP does. So people are able to move more when they're having these like delirium states on PCP than with ketamine. So for a long time, like it was just considered like ketamine doesn't cause psychosis, but the people are having very similar like internal mind states. They just are too anesthetized still to move around and do anything about it. So to the medical doctors, they're like, it's not causing a problem, but it works in a very similar way. So it almost certainly causes a very similar delirium state in these high doses. Okay, importantly, a large part of our like belief that PCP causes psychosis was both like the cause of and reinforced by this unstoppable black man myth that was happening in the 80s and 90s. Basically the story was that Black men were taking PCP and gaining superhuman strength, and they couldn't be stopped by conventional weapons. And so all of these like white cops needed like hollow point bullets and like higher caliber weapons to shoot these Black men with in order to stop them. And they got those weapons. And they got those weapons on the backs of a myth that PCP causes psychosis and superhuman strength crossed over with the myth, the general myth, that Black men are superhumanly strong and inherently dangerous, right? Okay, so hopefully that did enough to make you seriously question your belief, if you had it, that PCP causes psychosis. Okay, next one. Heroin hijacks users' brains and causes addiction. And in other words, it cannot be used in moderation. Pulling government data, like SAMHSA, NIDA, government data, less than 30% of heroin users are addicted in the status quo, meaning that 70% of those people that are using heroin are using it in some sort of casual fashion. I'll just let that sink in for a moment. Cool. All right. So importantly, this is a status quo in which heroin is highly adulterated and highly stigmatized, and it's still only 30%. It is regarded by many as the last step before death, a quasi-suicidal activity. And this is because we have made heroin so deadly and its users so marginalized, not the drug itself. I believe that if we expand access and change our cultural attitudes, heroin might have more users, but it would have less addicts, actually, than even this current 30%. And it turns out that all drugs have a minority of users who are addicted, like heroin. On that scale from like LSD to heroin, like even at the most extreme end of it, it's like 28 to 35%, depending on like the particular data you look at. Okay, so here's a question in like a political science philosophy way. Can we justifiably limit our general right to alter consciousness in order to save a minority of citizens from developing addiction? Is that a just thing for us to do as a society, knowing that it is a minority of people? Also, it's important to point out that this 30% is while the drug is illegal now. Like it's not, the prohibition is not stopping these people from getting addicted. So anyway. Okay, another example that I think will really upend some of this assumptions about heroin. So just prior to Nixon's declaration of the war on drugs, it was reported that over 15% of US soldiers fighting in the Vietnam War were heroin addicts. In response, the Nixon administration launched an extensive study into the addicted servicemen. At the time, relapse rates for drug addicts were hovering around 90%, and heroin was regarded as the most addictive drug on the planet. Once you get hooked, you're hooked for life. Surprisingly, however, the study found that the number of Vietnam servicemen who took heroin 1 year after returning home to the US was only 5% of that original number. 95% of the people who said that they were addicted to heroin kicked the habit all on their own without formal treatment in a year after coming back from Vietnam. How could this be? The soldiers had been consuming heroin regularly, some of them for years, but nonetheless, so many of them appeared to have simply dropped the habit when they got home. If the chemical hooks of heroin, purported to be the strongest of all drugs, are the primary driver of heroin addiction, how could this possibly be the case? I argue, as many others have, that the sharp decline in heroin use in this population was due to a rapid change in their environment. They went from a war-torn nation where they were expected to kill other human beings back to their lives at home. Put simply, for many of these servicemen, the things they were using heroin to anesthetize themselves from had been removed, so their need to use so did as well. The drug's chemical power was only a small part of the issue. So I'm just gonna let that happen, and like we can sit with that however we want in our belief about the chemical hooks of heroin. And I have a lot of other examples, but I'll leave it there. Okay, and the last one. Opioid use will inevitably cause overdose and death. With careful attention paid to increasing tolerance and reliable knowledge about the drug's purity and potency, opioid users can actually live long and healthy lives. For example, pain management specialists in the late 90s and early 2000s were giving some patients huge doses of Oxycontin. We all know about this, 1,000 milligram plus doses of Oxycontin. While many recoil at this idea, it's important to point out that none of these users were dying from overdoses because they were slowly brought up to that dosage. Many of them, in fact, only started dying when the government reacted to the opioid epidemic and forced doctors to end those prescriptions. Those users were then largely forced onto a dangerous black market of adulterated, non-pharmaceutically pure opioids. Okay, next. this is also interesting. Many field surgeons in World War I developed morphine addictions. They were in terrible, traumatizing conditions, and they had unfettered access to pure morphine. So because of that, because of their medical background and access to a pure supply, many of these morphine addicted surgeons lived into old age, 80s and 90s, without ever kicking the habit, right? And it's because they knew they had pharmaceutically pure access to opioids, right? And they knew how to slowly build themselves up in their tolerance. And that's not something that people on a black market have access to. It, like, literally wouldn't be possible if those surgeons were living today and had to deal with the current like inventory and diversion controls the DEA puts towards controlled substances. They would have to be going off of street use, and there's no way to know the purity and potency for street use. So they definitely wouldn't have lived to 80s and 90s. So this is, again, just to point out this impression that like opioids or heroin or PCP are these like evil drugs that only are a problem and they only hurt people. I am very confident that that's bullshit, right? And that these drugs can be harmful. These drugs can be used in an improper way that causes more harm than it would benefit others, but they also can be very beneficial drugs. Like opium is the oldest plant medicine in the history of the human species, as far as we know, right? Like the idea that these things couldn't have benefit and therefore should just be eliminated and not be allowed to have for us to have access, I think is just absolutely absurd. Certainly, it's not scientifically backed. There's nothing to suggest that these things are true about those, that they cause these problems. I could talk about this for ages. I kind of just added this slide in the last minute, but I'm kind of just hoping to open your perceptions about like the things that you believe about drugs. As you look into them more deeply, I think you are going to find that a lot of them are mistaken. Especially the ones that are intended to terrify you or tell you that any particular drug is just like poison or evil in some way. Likely not true. A molecule is a molecule. Okay. Implications. If we grant the cognitive liberties a basic right that we all should be afforded, I think there's a few major implications. First one, obvious one, no more drug war. The most important implication, the current model of restricting access or prohibiting most psychoactive drugs without any due diligence to establish harms is unjust. The current war on drugs must end immediately. It is in fact a human rights violation. Moreover, those who have been imprisoned, prosecuted, or otherwise reprimanded by the state for exercising their inalienable rights ought to be freed and compensated for their suffering. Next, I think we have a right to safe supply. Much of the personal harms caused by illegal drugs are directly due to the fact that they are illegal. Users of black market drugs don't know the purity or potency of their drugs, being too much instability in their lives and their use patterns. Dangerously potent additives and contaminants regularly kill users of all sorts of drugs, so much so that it is now the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. It's ridiculous. That's CDC data, if anyone's curious. Drug users need a safe supply, one that is unadulterated and accurately dosed. To not, in whatever way, make those substances available in a safer form is to fail to provide the basic support necessary for the real exercise of our right to have this opportunity to alter consciousness as we choose. This is no doubt a stretch for some. Rather than a right for the state not to interfere with an individual seeking altered states, this would suggest that the state has an obligation to provide or in some way ensure a safer supply of drugs. Nonetheless, I do think that we should be granted this right, just as we're given roads and buses and sewer lines and like other things that are like absolutely necessary for the exercise of our basic freedoms of movement and health and safety, right? It's something that the state provides. Just also like accurate consumer info, right? Like about the things that we're consuming. The reason that you need to know what's in your food, the reason there needs to be a nutrition label on the back and it needs to be accurate is because we assume that consumers have a basic right to know what the contents of their things are, right? And that's because you can't exercise freedom without knowledge. If you don't know what you're taking, then you're not exercising any sort of freedom to choose to alter your consciousness because you don't know what you're taking, right? Okay. So expansive state-funded testing facilities might be able over time to improve consumer knowledge about illicit drugs that they are consuming, like in Portugal. But more realistically, however, I think that access in some way to pharmaceutical grade sources would be the best way to ensure a right to safe supply, which means legalization, more or less. Okay, so once again, the way we think about this issue is more critical than the specific policy solutions. Safe supply and accurate consumer information shouldn't be thought of as charity or a great accommodation our society is making for drug users. Accurate consumer information is an essential part of informed consent in a capitalist economy. Tylenol does not do us any great service when they ensure their product is free of fentanyl. They are meeting a basic demand of consumer protection in a modern economy. Drug users deserve to know what is contained in the drugs they are consuming. Cognitive liberty is an empty right if the substances we are given access to are so tainted that we risk our lives every time we explore an altered state. So that's why I think we have a right to safe supply. Lastly, call for research. I think the only way to respect our rights to cognitive liberty and provide some kind of just regulation to the drug market is to have a lot more research on the wide world of drugs and their effects. Users need reliable, objective information on safe dosages, possible adverse events, medication contraindications, etc. Policymakers need reliable, objective information on the potential risks of various drugs and for various activities. And we can't do this without a lot of publicly funded science, and very specifically, asterisk, science that isn't anti-drug in its assumptions, which I think is a major problem right now. Most science that's being done on drugs is literally funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which makes like its existential assumption is that drugs are dangerous and harmful to people, right? Okay, and that's it. Thank you, everyone. That's the whole presentation. I know I blew through that, but yeah. Anyone have any questions? Yes, you can't access freedom without knowledge. Right.
I just really like that quote.
Nice. I'm glad that there's some quotable moments.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, Brendan.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a point early on in your talk where I found myself going, oh, because you were like, if the government tells you that like you don't have the right to that, then they're mistaken. That's a human rights violation. And I was like, who decides what's a human rights violation?
Yeah, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's
okay.
Like there are internationally governing bodies. So like the idea of human rights evolved out of World War II, and an attempt to like the Nuremberg treaties, like to try to make certain actions by states like illegal. But then the question becomes, if the state is the ultimate arbiter of the law, then in what sense can they be illegal, right? And so these like international governing bodies that I would argue are mostly philosophical and symbolic, but nonetheless, yeah. And so I would say by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think it's pretty clear that prohibition, especially I'd say arbitrary prohibition, is a human rights violation. How was that for people? Was it like incredibly fast and confusing?
It was a little fast, but
Okay,
it was a lot of good info. I see it's unmuted.
Yeah, I thought it was really awesome. I think it like broke like my brain is like rewiring around like a lot of biases and stuff. So yeah, I feel like I could watch it back on slow motion just to like get my brain up to speed with like what it learned, and just like what it's picking up on. But I think one of the things that was just I noticed my brain keep doing, and just like what your presentation and what you kept saying brought me back to like the present moment of like I kept catching myself wanting to be like, how do we do this? How do we do this? How do we do this? You know, versus, and you continue to say this, I like really appreciate this, is like just this is bringing it forward, right? Like this is like bringing the biases forward and bringing forward like what we actually need to do and like what are the harms. So I just like appreciate the stance of the presentation, and yeah, I have like so many questions wrote down that I need to like go do research on, but I really appreciate it.
I mean, you certainly are welcome to ask whatever. I mean, I am not like a policy person. I think a lot about drug policy simply because I like believe like in my body that we have a right to legalization. And so then the question becomes like, what next, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, is heroin going to be available behind the counter at 7-Eleven? Like, you have to be 18 years old, but otherwise, like, Bayer can advertise it on TV and like give you like direct messaging on your phone and shit to like get you to try it. Like, is that really the world that I want? And I don't know. Like, I don't know if like the best version of the world is one where like heroin is sold by Bayer at 7-Eleven, but I'm positive fewer people would die. So it's really hard to, yeah. And I am kind of to a certain degree grateful that no one will really listen to me in like changing this, right? Like I can just act as like a philosophical like North Star without necessarily being able to have all the answers, because there are like hopefully lots of other very intelligent, careful humans that will join me in this effort slowly.
Well, and I just think like the backing sort of ideology of having the right to our minds is like so important. And I think it's something that's growing in popularity as people become concerned about technology and ads and things too. So I think it's like a really interesting place to start. And I think it's like incredibly important. And I haven't like heard this yet. So thanks for bringing it.
Nice. I'm glad to hear that. There are a handful of like people that have talked about this before me, but I think that it is like something we're not talking about very often. And it's also something that lots of disparate groups that I think separately have an interest in a right to mental self-determination aren't working together about. Like for instance, like the transhumanists, right? Like people that want to be able to like install chips in their brains and shit. Like, you think the government's going to let you do that if they won't let you get high? Like, you know what I mean? Like we all have an interest in like in having ownership over our minds and freedom from interference, and also the freedom to pursue changing those minds, right? And that right currently is unspecified, you know, and I don't see a lot of like biohackers over here in the drug policy space arguing for cognitive liberty, but I think that we all have shared interests in something on paper that says that we have this freedom.
Yeah, this is inspiring something for me. I'm over here, I'm going on a rampage in my mind. I'm really struck by your comment on the opioid, like when the opioid thing happened and doctors were restricted, and that's why a lot of people, they couldn't keep prescribing. And, you know, hearing you talk, this is absolutely true that I've personally had really bad pain before and had no access to pain meds, like when I really needed it for female reasons. And like it was really, really bad. And now it's like I feel like a scarcity around that. Like I can't get the help that I need. I'm not trusted by doctors to get the help that I need when I need it. And so there's so much suffering that's happening, like unnecessary suffering. And of course, like if we can do something to help that, we have so many other problems to figure out as a world population, that this kind of stuff, like, it seems so simple. It just seems simple.
Yeah, right. Especially relative to like world hunger and, you know, climate change. You know, like I feel it really is very simple. And actually, let me just go on like a little rant here, because I got into really like deep in the data about this story about the opioid epidemic being like the result of doctors overprescribing, and then people got hooked because opioids have a chemical hook and they get you, and then you're stuck for the rest of your life, et cetera, right? I was just skeptical, right? And I am just skeptical in general of narratives that involve like drugs that have healed people for a millennia being evil. Like it just doesn't, I don't quite follow. And so I kind of looked into it, and so let's say 2006, 2007 is when the government's coming in and they're noticing that there is like a lot of opioid prescriptions out in the world, and a lot of it's getting diverted, and you're getting people that are like not prescribed painkillers overdosing accidentally on painkillers because they just took too much of them or whatever, right? At that time, like peak crisis for that, we were looking at like 7,000 to 10,000 opioid deaths in America a year. Like that's where we were at. That was the like terrifying number that like led us to react, right? So it was around 2006, 2007, the government decides it's an epidemic, it's a crisis. There's way too many white kids dying. We can't be having this. We need to do something about it, right? And so by 2010, they have instituted essentially, I mean, it has been argued that they didn't actually put the force of law behind this standard, but they I think they basically did. They took the war on drugs to doctors and told them, they started taking down pill mills and getting doctors like off the streets and without licenses, who they decided had been like recklessly prescribing opiates. And as a result, by like 2010, 2012, all of the people who were on these like high opioid doses had been taken off of them or significantly reduced down, because doctors were like afraid of being criminalized, right? So 2010 is kind of what I think of as like the turning point, right? That's like when all these people who are on those prescription opiates go off, right? 2010, the overdose rate for opioids in the United States is like 15, maybe like 18,000 a year. You can watch the curve go from this line to an exponential increase when they pushed everyone off of their opiate prescriptions, right? Because at just about that same time, 2010, 2012, fentanyl starts to enter the black market as like a potential alternative to heroin, right? By 2014, it's being customarily cut into street heroin. And now, today, 2021, I think it was 110,000 deaths from opioids in the United States, leading cause of death for Americans age 18 to 45. And the story is still that it was doctors' faults that they put us on these opioid drugs, when what killed people was the government forcing them off, right? Like, and you can just look at the numbers. Like the numbers make it totally clear. Just like look at opioid death rates relative to like legislation policy shifts. And I think it is alarming, the degree to which I think it is very clear that doctors didn't do this. The DEA did. The DEA is killing people. Yeah. You got to look at the data. That's the thing. It's because like how you interpret data, that's always going to be based off of like your agenda and like the governing body and what they want you to think, you know, and like the narratives that we feel like acceptable. And the data can also be biased. I mean, it is, I would argue it's always biased, but it's usually less biased than its interpretation. And so you can just go back and like grab that data. A little asterisk actually to that whole thing about like story. It isn't quite as clean as that. And someone might come back on me and be like, it's not quite that clean. And I agree. So something weird happened in 2010 where the potency of heroin also just got way higher. Like fentanyl hit the market, black market, and heroin got stronger, and the government pushed everyone off of their opioid prescriptions like within 5 years of each other. And that in like a little tempest in a teapot caused what I would consider the modern opioid epidemic. One theory for why heroin got stronger in 2010 is that the Taliban actually limited supply. They were trying to decrease the like global supply of heroin to increase the value of their personal supplies of opium gum, and that they stopped doing that at around 2010. So there was like a shock back where heroin became suddenly cheaper again, and so people were making it stronger. But I don't know if that really makes that much sense. I'm pretty sure most of the heroin we get in the United States isn't actually from the Middle East. I'm pretty sure it's like a hemispheric thing, like opium grown in the West is consumed in the West, and in the East consumed in the East, but who knows? Okay, well, we still have 30 minutes or whatever. I feel like we can just chill, talk about things if we want. We can end it early. I don't care.
I have another question about well, this is kind of like just a specific question. Do you know of any books about the like the regulation around opioids around Asian populations? Is that what did you say something about that at the beginning?
Yeah, okay, so early on, there's actually a really interesting history, if you ever want to get deep into it. A history of opium is quite fascinating. There was this period in time when, so the British were shipping super cheap opium to China. And China was getting a bunch of opium addicts, and so they tried to make the drug illegal. And Britain literally went to war to prevent them from making opium illegal. They're called the Opium Wars, which
Oh.
is actually a really interesting parallel to today, where most of the fentanyl was being made in China and they were giving it to us, and then they don't have an opiate issue and we have an opiate issue and we're a British colony. Interesting world dynamic there. But anyway, so we're talking back, this is, I don't even know for sure, but this is like 1800s to be safe. Like just, I'm just use 100-year period, 1800s.
Okay.
So as a result of like a lot of Chinese people being addicted to opium, when they were immigrating to the west coast of the United States and like being sort of like put into forced labor to like build railroads and do all kinds of other stuff, they brought their habit of smoking opium with them. And so in the United States, when they were first going after opium and opium related products, they were consistently tying the ideas of opium to racist depictions of Chinese people. Because of this idea that Chinese people are the ones that use this stuff, right? And very literally, like every single campaign to make a drug illegal, sort of like where we are now, where the DEA just unilaterally and without announcing it decides things are illegal. When there used to have to be campaigns to make things illegal, those campaigns were always affiliated with like some very specific racist thing. You know, like this drug should be illegal because the wrong kinds of people use it, basically. Yeah. So, and one of the first ones was opium and Chinese immigrants. Like that was like the thing, like opium dens and all that sort of stuff. The issue wasn't.
I mean, it brings in such like a fascinating social multicultural lens too, right? And like the oppression lens
Totally,
of right of like controlling certain populations. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, and like, and it's interesting to see like people are like the war on drugs was a failure. And it's like I think it was one of the most successful social control tools that has been implemented in the last 150 years. Like it, I think it worked really well, actually, because I think its purpose was to systematically marginalize and oppress people that those particular white men decided that like they didn't want in this country, or they wanted to make sure were kept down. And I think that it has done that quite effectively.
Have you read what was Michael Pollan's most recent book? I'm pretty sure I saw
Your
it.
Mind on Plants.
Your Mind on Plants. The chapter about opium. I'm thinking of a specific part, and maybe you'll remember it in more detail, because I remember being very like scared and also confused by it. It was like, there's a certain type of poppy that you can make into opium, but it's only illegal to grow it, not if you plan to, just if you even know how to turn it into opium. And him being like very nervous about that.
Totally. Yeah.
Is it still where we're at with that, or like, am I even recalling that section right?
I think you were calling it correctly. I remember hearing it and thinking the same thing. Like, I wonder if it's still like that now. My assumption there is that, so the knowledge piece, one of the reasons, like just in general, in like legislation and law and legal thinking, they kind of are allergic to talking about states of mind. And the reason, I think, is because it gets so wishy-washy, right? Like, because like, so knowledge is related to intent, and intent is related to whether that thing should be illegal. So like, if I'm just trying to grow a flower that I don't know is drugs, then my intent, according to the DEA, is like, okay, right? But if I'm growing a flower that I intend to personally consume in the form of a tincture, I guess you still could do that, just not with opium, because you do it with all kinds of other things, right? But yeah, and like specifically, I think what is still the case, just because I've heard of people getting in trouble for this, it's scoring your opium poppies, which is like the way that you get it to extract the like opium gum. But it literally is just as complicated as taking like a knife or something else sharp and scratching the thing, right? So like, but yeah, technically, if you were to get caught at the Garden of Opium Poppies and several of them have been scored, the DEA would point to that. It's like you drug manufacturer. Yeah, I like to think about this stuff too, like just how thin the line is. You know.
Yeah, well, because I'm kind of in a tricky place of like, okay, I own this book, which tells you how to do it. Help facilitate this group.
Mhm.
And I also very genuinely love the aesthetics of poppies.
They're beautiful
Uh,
flowers.
yeah, and I like was considering growing them prior to reading this book, and then I was like, oh shit, can I do that? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I would say that you have a right to,
Yeah, but then I'm like talking
whether or
about
not the government recognizes it.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess this was a lot of how he posted in the book too, was like, you can, it's your right, know the risks. And know like that the government will not see it in a kind light.
Yeah.
So to do what you can to protect yourself.
Totally.
Yeah.
You know, and to be fair, right, like sitting in prison on like an opium charge and like saying like I had a right to this, I'm a political prisoner, that's only going to get you so far in life. So you got to make your own choices. But if it helps, if you ever were to go down for it, I would be arguing that you're a political prisoner and it's a human rights violation.
Bless. Thank you.
Whatever that means, whatever the impact of that would be.
So I'm thinking about this more, and I'm wondering, Brendan, if your thesis here is that regulate, like I'm thinking about regulation in general, like of drugs, like
Yep.
prescription drugs or whatever, FDA approved and all that stuff. And I think like, wow, there's so many cases, like fringe cases and statistical outliers that fall through the cracks of data
Mhm.
in some of the things that you cited. And it seems like data in like the misinterpretation of data as well, like as we've seen in the pandemic and,
Mhm.
all this knowledge we've all been learning about like how do you interpret data and like who do you listen to and how do you, it's like, I'm wondering what you think about, do you have like a vision for how the right amount of information could be imparted and the right amount of regulation could actually be harm reducing rather than making more complicated a system that's already not working?
Yeah. And I have some, I can just share with like you with the musings that I've like come across. But again, like the idea of writing policy is daunting. And I like, yeah, because there are always going to be situations where like make no mistake, like in a world in where drugs are legal and like to some degree like access is wide, like people will hurt themselves with these substances and they will hurt other people when they're altered on these substances. Like those things will happen. It is not my argument that those things will never occur. It is simply my argument that like that doesn't mean that we don't have a right to those things. Like for instance, driving your car is one of the most dangerous things that you do, like ever, on a daily basis. So much so that it could be easily argued that we shouldn't be allowed to have cars and roads, that it should just be public transportation, right? Because I mean, until 2021, it was the leading cause of death for Americans age 18 to 45. It was recently surpassed by fentanyl-related drug overdoses. But so that doesn't mean that we don't have a right to drive our car, right? It means that right is conditional. There's like all these things, right, that you have to like do. You have to be 16, you have to get a license, you can't be intoxicated to a certain degree. Like you have to do all these things to like drive your car, right? And that doesn't mean that it's unjust that we have to go through those things, right? But like it does mean that there's like some sort of like middle ground to be met. Although when it comes to cars, I do wonder about that. Like when there's alternatives like public transportation, maybe they should turn into a separate conversation about how we should make cars illegal. But ultimately what, so when we're trying to like come up with like a drug regulatory system, what I have in mind, my favorite idea is kind of like a state run, like, how they have like in Canada, all of their liquor has like in a store that's like separate. Like it's not like in the grocery store, it's like in a separate place. I'm kind of imagining that, but for like everything, right? And like you, as long as you're 18 and like meet certain, you know, very minimal requirements, right? Then you can shop at the store and consult with people that are experts on drugs and their effects, and like just like a pharmacy or whatever, right? And like maybe there is some sort of thing where like psilocybin is on the over the counter, right? Like you can get it anywhere, but to get heroin, you have to go to up to the pharmacist, right? Or like the behind the counter, right? To like get that thing. So it's like not quite as available. Maybe there's a little bit more restrictions on that. The thing I always get stuck in is that every restriction you make, every way you make it harder to obtain any substance, people will still use it. They will just use it in the black market, right? And so like you're not actually stopping people from getting high on heroin by making it behind the counter, right? You're just increasing the number of people who will get heroin another way, right?
And I even think about like that behind the counter, like changing what that looks like, of like a prohibitive thing of like, if you want this, it's just as much easy access, but you need to have someone trained who knows how to administer it to you, because it can be dangerous if you administer it wrong or things like that for safety.
Totally. Right. So like, and that's great. Thank you for that clarification. So importantly, like, and this is partially the access thing, like behind the counter doesn't mean you need a doctor's note to get the thing. Right. And in fact, I don't think any of the prescriptions should work that way. I think doctors are poor gatekeepers for psychoactive substances. And we have like very clearly seen that as the government has tried to prosecute them for giving those substances away. It's an absurd idea that a doctor should be in charge of giving people psychoactive and potentially addictive substances, but only if they're not addicted or not drug seeking or like whatever the fuck the like line is, right? Like it doesn't make any sense and it doesn't work, right? And all it does is make a whole bunch of doctors that simultaneously want to help you and are afraid for their freedom, right? Which, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of that. So anyway, so I'm thinking it'll be like behind the counter would be like, you can get it, but you have to like talk to a harm reductionist for 10 minutes, right? Or you have to like use it in a supervised consumption setting that's like attached to the building, right? Like you can shoot this, but a nurse needs to be here for the first 30 minutes or something, right? Or like if you use one of these substances, if like you're buying one of these substances, you know, like you can't be on it while you're operating heavy machinery. Like if they catch you, you know, like nodding out behind the wheel, that's still illegal, you know, or like, you know, so there's all kinds of things that potentially come into place, but they all get more and more complicated. So like, for instance, the behind the wheel problem. How much is too much behind the wheel? Like what's 0.08 for heroin, right? Like we don't have one, right? We don't have one for THC, and it's been legal in Denver or legal in Colorado for like 15 years or 20 years, whatever it's been, right? Like, and it's still, if they can do a blood test and if any THC shows up in your system, you get a DUI, right? Which is ridiculous because everyone metabolizes THC at different rates. And the person could be totally sober, like functionally sober. You could submit them to whatever battery of tests you want, and they would be sober, but they could have a THC level that's like identifiable. And that would have to change. I think that's also unjust and a human rights violation because it's arbitrary, right? The problem is it's an arbitrary limitation of your rights, right? And the government must justify limitations on rights and must take our rights as like a significant factor, right? Like it can't just be like, you don't have this anymore. Like why? Because we have a governmental organization that's decided that it shouldn't happen, right? Like there has to be some sort of like method to be justified. I kind of default to science a little bit. There's a lot of problems with that too. I don't really know what to say, but we need some kind of like less unjust way to like prioritize things, or I say we just have to be complete free for all, like giving it out on the streets, like, you know, I don't know, but because at least that's just, at least that's fair, right? Like I don't know if that's like the best version of things, but at the very least, like access to safe supply is ensured and people's right to alter their minds is respected. Yes.
I feel like, again, I'm chewing on so much. Like I appreciate your like live brain dumps. It's really incredible. Something that I've been thinking about since you said about like driving the car, like we allow people to do these like super dangerous things like driving a car. And you said something earlier about like, is all drug use therapeutic? And I'm like thinking about this shift in society. Like I think even like working from home, like people are spending so much more time on the computer, and like the act of driving a car at some point was like an extremely valuable thing for people to do. And so like not being able to drive a car was like enabling them to do this like valuable societal act, right? And it feels like now, and I think biohacking is like such an interesting case study on this. It's like people have found out ways to like hack their brain so they're incredibly efficient, and then therefore they have more access to money and funds and therapy and freedom and privilege and blah blah blah, right? All of these things. And I don't know if this is like elementary stuff, but it's clicking in my brain and kind of like shocking me in some ways. Like there's a value to this besides, I don't know, that wasn't a good like bottom line of what I'm thinking, but
right, which is like there is a degree to which like I consider the whole conversation around like which intentions are good enough intentions to be really dangerous, right? That for kind of reasons I was explaining earlier, like because like ultimately I do think all use is therapeutic use. Like if somebody is like addicted to heroin because they have like back pain and got pushed off of their opiate prescriptions, that sounds to me like therapeutic use. You know what I mean? Like if somebody is smoking weed every day because they can't focus without it, right? That sounds to me like therapeutic use. Like I know people that recreationally, casually use methamphetamine the way that we would use Adderall because they have access to it. You know what I mean? Like the drug itself doesn't dictate how people use it, and how people use it doesn't necessarily dictate how it goes for them. But at the same time, like, and that's kind of why I talked about like your right to get high, because like I think that even the most like superficial, silly, non-serious reasons for using drugs should still be protected, actually. Even if it's just to get high, even if it's just to explore, even if it's just to go with your friends and watch a children's cartoon, I think you have a human right to that. Not necessarily to the children's cartoon or to basic cable or Netflix or any of those things, right? But like you have the freedom to do those things if they're available.
Well, and there's also, I mean, the funniest thing about that, I think sometimes is like there's also scientific research that like watching Netflix, cuddling your cat is like really good for you, right? I don't know if that specific thing, please don't quote me on that. I have no idea if that specific thing, right? But like going outside and putting your hands in the dirt. It's like, well, if I need to have some mushrooms in order to go and like put my hands in the dirt, then like, fine, you know? And there's like research showing both of those things. So
correct.
I know, sorry. I know that my brain is just.
No, totally. But like, should you have to justify to like the
No,
state or a doctor or anyone
no,
your desire to put your hands in the dirt? No, absolutely not.
no.
Like even the idea that it should be mediated by someone else than yourself, right, is wrong. Because you have a fundamental ownership of your mind and your body. Like you can do whatever you want, you know. Like, and so to have that, to even have like a mediator, like that's supposed to be able to stop you and gatekeep that activity, like. Yeah, and I think it's just as wrong to like be against, you know, going outside and putting your hands in the dirt or whatever, right, as it would be to take psilocybin or heroin or, you know, skydive or, you know, like, it's just not, I think it's an unjust place of the state to be involved in, right? Like it just isn't, it's no good.
I appreciate it so much. I'm fired up.
Yeah. A lot of these ideas I've like borrowed from like libertarianism, and that's also kind of why I talked at the beginning about like the white supremacy and the individualism and capitalism and all this other kind of stuff, right? Because like, yeah, these same ideas are used in lots of other ways that I wouldn't necessarily approve of, and it gets very like dicey around like how do we navigate? Is there actually some real difference between like guns and cars and drugs, or like should we all have complete freedoms with no restrictions? Like, yeah, there's definitely people like there's different period like groups of thought that are having similar thoughts about different things, going to a different direction than I am.
I know I'm talking a lot tonight, so if anyone
Thank you so much for talking.
Okay, well, I'm fired up too, and I'm thinking about the conversation or the things you just said, and how like restrictions, okay, let's say mandates or regulations, that this brings me back to the whole mask argument that I know I don't really want to talk about, but like everyone's argument with we don't want to wear masks or we don't want to get vaccines because we have bodily autonomy, like, and all that. And then so in my mind, I was always like, you know, not to like get into political views on this because it's not really a thing right this second, but I just think that I made my decisions for like the betterment of society and the protection of the vulnerable. And so I'm just trying to say that one could argue that access to these substances, since all use is therapeutic use, which is another quote that I pulled from you.
I stole that. It's not mine. I don't know exactly whose that is, but
Cool.
I can't claim credit.
Like, my argument then is, you know, if all use is therapeutic use, then wouldn't it be for the betterment of society if everyone had access to the substances that they needed to make the world a better place?
I mean, I agree. Yeah, and I mean, in terms of like protecting the most vulnerable and that sort of thing, I think to talk about the pandemic and vaccines and masks and stuff, I think a lot of these conversations like have come up and have been like things that we're talking about in society. Like, at what point can you limit individual liberty in order to protect the public good, right? And we say that that is the way we think about rights. You know what I mean? Like, you really can't run into a crowded theater and yell fire. Like, they really will potentially prosecute you for that. But you nonetheless have the right to speak freely, right? Like, and we don't, you know, there are certain situations in which we limit those, and that's the minutia, that's the gray area, that's the thing we debate back and forth, like what's okay, what's not. You know, like there are some people that are like, that's never okay. Any limitation on individual liberties is like a completely intolerable encroachment of state power. And then there are like other people that are like, the state should be governing everything you do. It should be this like paternalistic entity that decides what's safe for you and like basically like infantilizes you to like, you know, decide how you should move forward and all these things. And then somewhere in the middle, I think, is like where a lot of people sit, and then it just gets very gray, you know. So like, I can't answer, and I won't answer whether like mandatory vaccination is like an acceptable violation or like overruling of bodily autonomy for like public good. But I am saying like that's kind of math we're talking about. We're talking about like how we should be regulating drugs and like how we should be moving forward, right? Which is like the default assumption is that forced vaccination is a rights violation, right? And so therefore shouldn't be allowed. And you should only allow for like instances where mandatory vaccination, or I would say even like coerced vaccination, like making vaccination contingent on people's employment and stuff like that, right? Like that there are only, you have to justify situations in which you've decided and you think it's like compelling and the state believes it's compelling for opportunities in which that can happen. And we see that it still feels like incredibly wrong. Like I would hate personally to be someone that very much felt that vaccination was not the right choice for me and my body, and nonetheless was like forced and coerced to by the state of my society, right? Like whether or not that's just, right, it feels bad, like for sure. And I think that like feeling bad is like, we like know that that's like something that we can't just willy-nilly do to people, right? Like it's like a very heavy thing to overrule someone's decision about what happens to their own body, right? Something that has an immense amount of weight that must be accounted for.
Yeah, and as I also want to say that I'm really grateful that I was given access to a vaccine if I wanted one, you know, to keep, you know, for whatever reasons I had access. So
totally, you know,
I'm grateful that those type of regulations are in place where there's like a program, like you were saying about like, here's this accessible way that you can get this substance that will have the desired effect.
Totally, right. And like in those types of situations, that's also a good example of like, so bringing this back to the right to safe supply, that's an instance in which the government the state has decided that there is like an impending like public health good, right, that needs to be like enacted. Like it would be best for society if we all did this thing. That's like at least what the state's perception is. They then have an obligation to provide like free and easy access and safe access to those things, right? Like to those vaccines and all, and you know, and so similarly, like when we recognize that we have a right to alter our consciousness however we see fit, right? And the government recognizes that there's that like a public good, right, to like having this like freedom, then some level of safe supply, I think, is an obligation. And I've been told that it's 8 o'clock, so thank you all for coming. It was great to have you here. Feel free to send me any questions you have. Or
Thank you, Brendan.
yes, thanks.
Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you all. Thanks, Brendan. Such a cool conversation.
Shall we bow
Awesome.
out really quick?
Oh yes, why not?
In true Naps fashion, we don't bow in, but we bow out.
Yes.
Hmm. Have a great night, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
See you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Brendan.
Bye.
Thanks, Brendan.